first time I ever met Herman Badillo, he was giving a talk to a classroom, something he does all the time, did all the time, as education is one of his priorities. And I was a young historian just coming into the business and feeling in awe that Herman Badillo, the first Puerto Rican congressman of the United States, was actually going to speak, and that great excitement that one feels. And Herman said to the audience, he said, something to this effect. Whenever I go in to speak to students, they're always very surprised to find out that I'm alive. Because I'm in the history books. And for students, if you're in the history books, you have to be long dead. And so now I think to myself, and I say, well, wow, we have Herman in the history books. So definitely we'll have Sonia Sotomayor in the history books. But this work of recovering our heritage and our history is so important because we have so many other people and so many other communities that need to be in the history books. And so with that, I'd like to turn to you and to give a little summary for the record of some of the things that you've done. You were, from 1962 to 1965, New York City Housing Commissioner under Mayor Robert F. Wagner. You were, from 1966 to 1970, Bronx Borough President, the first Hispanic origin individual to hold that position. You were, from 1970 to 1978, elected to the United States Congress, the first individual of Puerto Rican origins to hold that position. You were, from 78 to 79, Deputy Mayor of the City of New York, major responsibility to revitalize the South Bronx at that time. You were, from 1990 to 2001, member and chairperson of the Board of Trustees of the City University of New York, a position in which you take great pride, I know. And you are presently senior counsel for Parker, Wakeman, Alonso, LLP in Port Washington, in Long Island. So I want to take this opportunity to welcome you to Long Island as a Long Islander. And you have been the first in so many different instances where you have represented our community. And for that, I think that we're all grateful. But we want to know more about you. We want to know about the person behind all of the firsts. You were born in Caguas, in Puerto Rico, in 1929, August 21st. Virgo? Well, that explains
Leo.
everything. Leo?
Leo.
On the cusp of Virgo. That explains a lot. And you have very interesting memories of that time. Could you tell us something about that? Your early childhood in Puerto Rico, memories?
Well, in those years, there was an epidemic of tuberculosis in Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm. And in those years, tuberculosis was incurable. And my father, who was a school teacher, got tuberculosis, and he died when I was a year old. And my mother died when I was 5 years old of tuberculosis. And my grandmother and other relatives died of tuberculosis. And every time I tell this to a doctor, they say, let's get a chest x-ray. And I said, fellows, if I was going to die of tuberculosis, I would not be here at all, because all I remember was going to funerals and living with different relatives until they died, and then I went on to the other one. And eventually I came to live with an aunt who had 2 other children, and lived with her for a while. And she was the one who brought me to New York City at the age of 11.
Mm-hmm. That early experiencing so much death, How do you think that shaped you to be the man that you are today?
Well, it was very grim, as you can
Yeah.
imagine, and I remember all of the things that were happening, not just to my family, but to everybody, because everyone had a feeling of helplessness since it was incurable. And on the other hand, since I saw that this was affecting everybody, not just me, I realized that it was an epidemic that was happening. And I'm happy now that to say that I tell people that there's still people with tuberculosis in New York City, and I tell them that now it can be cured, and many of them can't believe it. You know, they don't want to go to a hospital because they're afraid of going to a hospital. So even today, it takes time to let people know that they no longer have to worry about that kind of epidemic.
Well, was that your Aunt Aurelia that
Aurelia,
brought
yes,
you?
yes, she died last year at the age of 96.
And she brought her other son with her.
She brought
as
one
well.
of her sons with. She decided to keep the other son with another aunt because she felt that I would have a better opportunity to progress in New York City than her other son. So that's how I got here.
Mm-hmm. So you came to live in El Barrio
In
at
Barrio,
that time?
yeah, 104th Street or something like that.
What were your first impressions?
Well, I was, of course, impressed by the big buildings and the number of people, because in those days, Caguas was a small town. I remember looking outside of the house that we lived in, and I saw the mountains in the distance. And I said, you know, someday I'm going to go over those mountains, because it seemed to me that the mountains and the sky met right there, and that was the end of the world. So I wanted to see what the end of the world looked like.
Did you do it?
I did, yes.
You went over the mountains?
More mountains and more problems.
What was it like living in El Barrio at that time? You
Well,
were 11 when
I
you
was
came.
11. I went to a school where the teachers could not speak Spanish, and I could barely speak English. And so that was true of all the other Puerto Ricans who were in the class. In those days, there were only Puerto Ricans in El Barrio. And I was able to get by because I learned a lot in Caguas, because when my mother died, the person in the other house next to us was a school teacher in the Escuela Muñoz Rivera across the street. So since they didn't know what to do with me, she said, look, let me take him and put him into first grade, although I still wasn't ready for first grade, theoretically. So I went to first grade with her, and when the tests were given, I came out ahead of the class. So she decided, well, you might as well pass. So I passed the first grade, and then I learned a lot in Puerto Rico. And so when I came here, I understood what was going on because I learned it in Puerto Rico. So it was very easy for me, because the only problem was translating the English to Spanish and then from Spanish back to English. So that's how I was able to move ahead. But I saw that my colleagues couldn't keep up, and most of them fell behind. And that was the reason that I became, at that point, committed to doing something about education, because I felt that this was happening to hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans and Latinos. Mm-hmm. And I believe that then I began, even at that time, to think that there should be bilingual education. I was only 11, but it occurred to me that it made no sense to go to school where they only spoke English and we only spoke Spanish, because all we could do was stare at each other. And that's what the Supreme Court finally said in the case of Lau against Nichols, that to ask students to speak English when they don't know how to speak English is to make a mockery of the school system.
When you started school in Manhattan, and you were able to understand the subject matter, the only problem was the translation. What were the techniques or the mechanisms that were put into place to help students like yourself who were coming?
None. nothing
So
fresh,
it was
no.
basically a total immersion
Yeah,
system.
absolutely, total immersion.
Yeah.
Well, immersion, as you know, was tough to get rid of, and I now teach bilingual, bicultural education at Korrol College. And I point out that there are many people in this city and in this country who, notwithstanding the Supreme Court decisions or the Bilingual Education Act that I helped pass, they still believe in immersion, and they don't agree that we should have bilingual education.
Mm-hmm.
So then, of course, I was the only thing immersion. And the attitude of the other people then and now is that it was good enough for the ones who came before, so it should be good enough for the Hispanics who are coming here now. So,
I know about immersion from experience because I think I sat in first grade for a year before I
Yeah.
understood what anybody was saying.
right.
What were there other institutions in the community that you can remember that were established to help the Puerto Rican migrants?
Not at that time.
At that point.
Because that was very early in the Puerto Rican migration.
Was 1941.
Yeah, very
Sure.
early. Much later, we developed a lot of institutions, many of which are still around. But then, as far as I know, nothing.
How did the community deal with the Second World War?
They
Do you
served,
remember?
I mean, they served
Yeah.
in the Second World War, as did everybody else.
Yeah, because the schools, I remember playing a big role in that, trying to make sure that the kids collected little pieces of silver from the,
Oh, yeah,
from the
they-
chewing gums and,
Yeah, people got involved.
yeah. And I understand that you also had other school experiences in Chicago and
Well,
in
yes, because
California.
my aunt brought me here, but
Yeah,
she was poor, we were all poor, of course, and she couldn't take care of me, so she sent me to an uncle in Chicago. And he had just recently arrived, and he couldn't take care of me either, so he sent me to another uncle in Burbank, California. And I stayed there for about 2 years. Then by that time, my aunt got settled in New York City. She had moved to West Harlem, and she called me back, and I returned to New York, and that's where I've been ever since.
what was schooling like in California and Chicago for Hispanic students? Or were you not in a situation?
No, I was about the only Hispanic, not the only Hispanic. I thought
Mhm.
Chicago was very interesting because I learned about Halloween, which we didn't have in Puerto Rico, and I went to the schools and learned a lot of things about the United States. And similarly, in California, I somehow, go back to Chicago, somehow or other, I volunteered to be on the school patrol to guide the students when they were coming to schools. Why I did it, I don't know, because I was terrified to see that many cars. I never have seen all those cars in my life. So here I am, can't speak English, I've never seen that many cars, and I'm helping the students to cross the street. So that was, I guess, the beginning of my public service.
Were you,
And then-
were you aware in Chicago of how segregated the city was at that time?
No, not at all, no. Except I was the only Puerto Rican, but, that didn't
Right.
concern me. But I was accepted by the other students. We got along quite well.
Mhm.
And I learned a lot about the United States.
Yeah.
Similarly, when I went to Burbank, California, there I had a problem going to school because my uncle and his wife, who were not happy to see me because nobody wants a 12-year-old coming into the house. And my uncle felt that I couldn't speak English, and therefore they didn't know what to do with me. So I knew this was about the time that school was opening. So I watched the students, people with students going to school, and I decided to follow them, and I enrolled myself in the school. And I kept going back and forth to the school. And after a while, my uncle says, "What do you do all day? My wife says you disappear during the day and you come back." Say, "I enrolled in school, the school over there." He says, "How do you do that?" I said, "I follow the students." And enrolled myself. So I said, "Oh, interesting." So that's how I got enrolled in school. And then This was a suburban area, Burbank, California, and I saw that there was a newspaper, so I got a job mowing lawns, because in those days the kids did all the lawn mowing. I made enough money to buy a bicycle, and then I joined the newspaper, and I had the paper route, which I would throw the papers in every afternoon after I got through with school. So gradually I worked myself into a lot of jobs, which I had done in Puerto Rico. Way back then, I figured out a barter system because we had no money. So I saw there was a movie house in Chicago, was the only one. Somehow or other, I talked the owner of the movie house to let me go in and clean the seats after the movie played. And in return for that, I could see the movies for free. So then I found out where he lived, and they needed someone to clean the floors and all of that. And in return for that, I would get food. So I worked out a system of moving along, and then I saw that there was a real estate office, and that they had newspapers. Of course, we had no money for newspapers, but we agreed that in the afternoon, after I got through with my duties, I would go and read the newspapers, sit there on the floor, read the newspapers, and give it back to them. So therefore, even we had no money, I was very well informed of what was going on. I read the newspapers every day, and I saw the movies all the time.
And how old were you at this point?
I was about...
About 13?
No, I was
Younger?
Puerto Rico. Before I got to be 11, I was about 7 or 8 or 9.
And you figured this out on your own?
Yeah.
Because I was going to ask you, well, who are your role models during this time? I mean, who are you watching that could...
There was nobody around, no.
Yeah.
That's I figured out on my own.
Yeah.
I mean, especially reading the newspapers, because not that many people had newspapers. I was passing by the real estate office.
Sure.
I saw they had newspapers. And I said, I'd go up to them and say, I like to read the newspapers. I guess they were surprised to see me ask such a question, because I was just a kid. But they said, okay, you want to read the newspapers? In the afternoon, you can come and do it. So I did every day.
Okay. Let me go back
So now
a little
we're going
bit.
back to
Yeah, let me go
California.
back to California.
Yeah.
No, actually, I want to bring you from California back to New York.
Okay, but just to go back to California, because there I really learned to speak English quite well, and I also made friends with a lot of the kids, and I joined the Boy Scouts, and became a member of what they called the Dawn Patrol. And in those days, Burbank didn't have too many people, and there were mountains, which I remember, from Puerto Rico. So we used to go hiking in the mountains all the time. And that was a very pleasant part of my being in California.
And when you came back to New York, you were fluent in English.
I was pretty fluent in English,
Okay.
right? Yeah.
All right. So tell us something about Manhattanville and Harran High School.
Well, it's the same problem, going back to the situation I had when I came here when I was 11. I had lived by then in the west side of Manhattan. So I went to junior high school, which was in West Harlem on 127th Street. And then the feeder school, high school for that, was Harran High School on 60th Street and 10th Avenue, which is now John Jay College. And I went to that school, and I found out that I was taking airplane mechanics, and I learned how to take apart internal combustion engines. I learned about mechanical drawing and drafting, but I thought it was pretty boring. So I noticed there was a school newspaper, and I joined the school newspaper, and I began writing articles for the school newspaper. I remember interviewing Peggy Lee, who had then just begun a singing career, and other people, and I had front page stories. And finally, one of the students in the newspaper said to me, "Are you a member of this school? Because we never see you anywhere." I said, "Yeah." He says, "So what do you do here?" I said, "I'm in airplane mechanics." He said, what are you doing that for? That's for blacks and Puerto Ricans. So I said, well, I'm Puerto Rican. He said, no, you don't understand. That is vocational training, and you're too bright to waste your time in airplane mechanics. You belong in the academic course, which you can do, and if you take the academic course, then you can go to college. I said, but I don't have any money for college anyhow. He said, you don't need it, because you can go to City College, which is free. I said, oh, great idea. So I switched to academics. I graduated with high honors and went to City College and graduated there magna cum laude. Went to Brooklyn Law School, graduated with number 1 in the class. And they couldn't figure this out in Harran High School. And that made me even angrier about the state of education, because what they were doing was orienting anybody who was black and Puerto Rican into vocational courses. And when people ask me, who was my mentor, believe it or not, was the kid in the who was in the newspaper, who gave me the right advice, because my aunt didn't know anything. She had not been able to learn to speak English. And the other kids didn't know any better. So if I had not joined the school newspaper, I probably would have ended up in airplane mechanics as manager. So that's why I was able to make a contribution to my aunt.
What did you major in City?
I majored in accounting and economics, because the reason for that was when I was going to be enrolled, I asked them, what can I take at City College that I can get a job after I graduate? They said, well, you can be a teacher, you can be an engineer, or you can be an accountant. I said, well, teaching I didn't want to do because I felt it was too limited to one career. I didn't want to do engineering because I felt that you could not have enough liberal arts courses. I looked at the curriculum and it was all engineering. I looked at business and accounting and I saw that I could have 2 years of liberal arts and 2 years of accounting. So I took that, I got the liberal arts, and that's how I became a certified public accountant. So I'm that as well as a lawyer.
And from City College, you went to Brooklyn Law?
Brooklyn Law School, yes.
Which was another success.
Another success, yes, in Brooklyn Law School. Again, I think I was the only Puerto Rican or Latino in the class, but I became a member of the law review and the moot court team, and I was going at night, but I graduated at the same time as the students in the day session, and number 1 in the classes, which was the first time that ever happened. So
and you were valedictorian?
I was valedictorian, of course, yeah.
Out of the class?
Yeah.
No, not of course. Not everybody becomes valedictorian. This is a great thing to do.
I felt I had to set an example to all the other people. Now we have a huge number of Puerto Ricans in Brooklyn Law School, and in fact I'm a trustee of Brooklyn Law School too.
And you teach at Korrol?
I teach at Korrol College. I'm what they call a distinguished professor, and I teach the bilingual bicultural education, and this semester the history and philosophy of education, which moves along pretty well till we get to New York City, and then goes downhill.
Okay, all right. We're going to get into that. When you finished law school, you got your law degree. You went into practice for a while, and then you decided to go into politics. Why?
Well, because politics? I went into practice with another young fellow who had graduated at the same time, and I began to get a number of cases, criminal cases, because the judges found out that I spoke Spanish, and very few, if any, lawyers spoke Spanish. So they assigned me to those cases. And I had a case, for example, of a kid 18 years old who was charged with robbery in the first degree, which was a very serious crime in those days. 10 to 30 years in prison. And the reason it was first degree is that the crime was allegedly committed at night. In the daytime it would not have been a problem, but at night it's a big problem. Supposedly he mugged an elderly man. So when I saw him, he had been in jail for a year. And I said, what happened? He says, I don't know. I don't remember anything. This is the date when you allegedly mugged the person. Do you remember? I said, no. I mean, who would remember what they were doing a year ago? And certainly, so then I looked up the date. I looked up the weather reports. I found out it was raining. I found out that the nearest light was around 100 feet away. I took pictures. So there's no way that elderly gentleman could have seen who it was. And so the kid was acquitted. I had other cases where the police arrested young people for no reason at all. One was the so-called riot on 98th Street, which had front page of the Daily News. And I talked to the people, and they said nothing was going on. The thing that was going on that was so bad is they were drinking beer on the stoops. So the police came, they saw a big crowd, they didn't know what to do, they took one kid and they brought him in. So I, again, went to trial, and the DA realized that he did not want to try this case, so he wanted to settle it. And they went before the judge, and the judge said, what do you mean settling this case? This was the big riot and it was in the summer, in July. There was a big riot on 98th Street. How do you explain that? And I said, Judge, that was a very hot day. In that day, the people who live in Westchester were in their backyards drinking cocktails and having a great time. The stoops are the cocktail area for the poor people. We said, okay, forget it, let it go. So that was. So then I came to the conclusion that you can't deal with law cases one-to-one. So I was advised by the only Hispanic judge at that time, Emilio Nunez, to get into politics. And I lived in West Harlem, about 145th Street. So I went to the district leader there, and I said, I would like to join the club because I'm a good speaker and I like to get people, Puerto Rican people, enrolled so they can vote. He said, oh, I'd like to join. I gave him my card. I offered to pay. I said, no, we're going to have the annual dinner next month, and we'll invite you. I said, okay, fine. I'm still waiting for the invitation. So I came to realize, because I went to other places, that the last thing anybody wanted was a smart-ass Puerto Rican who could talk to the people in Spanish, because they didn't want to do that. So finally, Judge Nunez said, you can go to the Caribe Democratic Club, where there's Tony Mendez, who was the only Puerto Rican district leader at the time. So I went there, and Tony was delighted to have me, and he invited me to give speeches whenever they wanted Puerto Rican to speak. He said, send Badillo. So I went to speak in Long Island, Town Hall, a lot of other places, representing the Puerto Rican community, and I got to be somewhat known. And that was how I got, and then I learned how politics works. I learned about getting signatures. I learned about sound trucks. I learned about all the tricks that are played to keep people from registering and voting. So that was very useful to me. Soon thereafter, it happened that John Kennedy was running for president, and they were looking for a Puerto Rican who would go into another area of East Harlem and register Puerto Ricans and blacks. Because although Kennedy had been supported by the Democratic Party citywide and statewide, he realized that he needed more votes because it was going to be a very close election. So he said he knew that the people who were in power, which were then predominantly Italians, would not do anything to do that because they never had done any of this. So he wanted someone who would go in and on his own oppose the regular organization. So I went to meet the Kennedy people, and I met Bobby Kennedy, Steve Smith, and the whole Kennedy clan, and they gave me money to set up a club in East Harlem, which I did, and I was only one person. So I stood outside, and people came in and said, what is this? I said, it's a political club. You want to join? Gradually, I built up a crowd, and I had people like Eleanor Roosevelt come into the club, and I have a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt in the first club, and then sometime later, Kennedy himself came with Jackie Kennedy, who was then pregnant with John, and we had a big rally on 116th Street on Lexington Avenue, which is known as
Lucky Corner.
the Lucky Corner, right?
Yep.
And Kennedy spoke and Jackie spoke, but the one who got the biggest applause was Jackie because she spoke Spanish fluently. But in any event, we got a tremendous increase in registration, although it was a question of fighting the Italian machine, because in those days, in that area, the congressman was Italian, the councilman was Italian, the state assemblyman was Italian, the state senator was Italian, the leader of the club was Italian. Everybody was Puerto Rican, Italian, but the people were predominantly Puerto Ricans. So they didn't know who I was, and when the registration period opened, and that was when we still had literacy tests, they kept trying to prevent people from registering and voting and keep them out. So I would go around the clubs, and one day I went to a voting place, and I said to the people there, "What's going on?" He says, "What's going on is this guy Badillo is pulling up this place with blacks and Puerto Ricans." So I said, "What are you going to do about it?" So I said, "Tell you what, school is supposed to close at 10. I'm going to close the school at 8 so that they won't be able to register." I said, "Good idea," because they thought I was an Italian, part of the Sant'Angelo organization. So then at 8 o'clock I was outside with some paper, and I got the names of the people who had been standing online for hours and were denied the right to go in. And I brought a case against the Board of Elections, and I won, because it was clear that the organization was run on. And that's how I got to be better known, because it was the first important case proving that there had been discrimination in registering and voting in New York City, even though it was absolutely illegal. Technically it was legal, but in fact, not just in East Harlem, but all over the city, if you wanted to register and vote, it was an obstacle course. So that helped to ease the situation, and that's why I got involved with the Voting Rights Act later on, because I knew that process
Which was
was still going on.
1965. Voting rights.
I testified in 1965. I put in the changes in the Voting Rights Act in 1975 when I was a congressman. But just one last thing about that period. I had all kinds of problems because I had death threats from the regular organization, which I promptly reported to El
So,
Diario.
but you were a Democrat.
I was a Democrat. So they were
opposing the Democrats.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they were afraid that if I registered enough Puerto Ricans and blacks, I would run against them, or somebody would run against them and win.
And you did.
And I did, yes. So they had a practical reason, but they used gruesome methods. And they broke into my apartment, they broke into the club, all of which I reported to El Diario. And I was told the guy who ran before me, not a Puerto Rican, was still floating in the East River because he had been killed. As a matter of fact, my son David, who's here, he was then about 6, 7 years old. I was told, if you walk along 116th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenue on a Saturday at 12 o'clock, you're going to be killed. So I took David, I walked back and forth, and nothing happened. Because I publicized that in El Diario, they were worried then. Mm-hmm. So finally, a group of tough-looking Puerto Ricans comes into the club on a Monday night, and the people there said, "Oh, now he's in trouble. They're going to kill him, push him." So they came up and they said, "Are you Herman Badillo?" I said, "Yeah." "You the guy who's been threatened by the Sant'Angelo organization?" "Yeah." I said, "Well, you don't have to worry about them anymore. We just went up there and we told them that if anything happened to Herman Badillo, they will all be dead within 24 hours. Thank you very much. I never saw them again. But after that, the Santander organization was very careful. He said, don't walk so fast because you can get hit by a car and we're going to be blamed. So I ended up being protected on all sides. But that's the importance of having publicity, because once the publicity was there, then I knew that it would not be permissible to do what they were planning to do.